Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello, William Kentridge. What a pleasure to have you on the phone. Thank you so much for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. I'm really delighted.
Good, happy to be with you.
Thank you so much. Tell me, where do I find you, and how are you spending these months, maybe these last 3 months?
Yes, you find me in my house in Johannesburg, in the kitchen. We're going through our proper winter cold snap, so it's about 0 degrees outside. Although in Johannesburg, winter always ends at 11 a.m. So by noon tomorrow, it will be up to 18 degrees or so centigrade, 65 or so Fahrenheit. It's paradoxical, but as a visual artist who works in a studio, and I have a studio in the garden of the house, it's been a kind of wonderful 3 months of quiet work in the studio, undisturbed by exhibitions, undisturbed by travel demands, while at the same time being completely aware of mayhem and chaos that is in the area just outside the studio. Mayhem that's common to all the world, but is also inflected with a particular South African and Johannesburg particularities.
Tell me about that.
Well, in a strange way, I mean, we're at the end of our lockdown here in South Africa, but we're at the end just as our infections are really rising extremely rapidly. And this is because the lockdown, which, for people who live in comfortable houses with comfortable gardens, the majority of white people in South Africa do, it was quite a comfortable time. But for a huge number of black South Africans who historically are living in townships, in informal settlements, social distancing is almost impossible. The loss of income and jobs has been enormous, and it was simply not possible to continue people not going to work and not having an income. There isn't the scale of social benefit to support the entire country during extended lockdown. So we're stuck with this paradox that the economy has just opened up at most probably just the time when it should be most closed down. So that is the broader picture of what's happening in South Africa. In a strange way, also, we get pushed back into a kind of apartheid world. Instead of a greater separation when people all had to go back to their own houses for our first 10 weeks of lockdown, you had privileged elite sequestered in their compounds and their houses, the working class, black working class sent back to their townships, and the movement between those areas was severely restricted.
In a way, the clock has turned backwards with this pandemic.
It turned back in a way. Also, it was quite a punitive lockdown in the sense that it was very policed by not just the police force, but by the army. And it suddenly had the sense of, again, of the South African army keeping black people in their townships away from other parts of the country. That's eased. That's changed. That there was enough of an outcry about for that to have changed. But it's still quite a Puritan feeling. For example, for the whole of the major part of the lockdown, there was no alcohol sold in South Africa or cigarettes. And in fact, tobacco products still cannot be sold. They eased up on liquor sales. So that is possible now. And I've sort of gone down to the last quarter of the bottle of whiskey before that was lifted. But it's been a good working time in the studio.
It must be very odd. On the one hand, you have what's happening inside the studio, and I'd love to ask you what you've, what kind of inspiration you've found in this moment, what kind of work you're doing. And on the other hand, as you said, the mayhem outside. Before getting to the work that you're doing in the studio. How does the United States and all the unrest that is happening in the United States play itself in South Africa? And what do terms like, let us say, since you mentioned the police, what does defund the police mean to South Africans at this moment?
In a strange way, so many of the things that you're going through in America have been the bread and butter in South Africa for so many decades, and have been so much under questions of consideration. So, for example, it seems that America and Europe is catching up 5 years later to South Africa in terms of what to do with colonial and racist monuments and monuments to people who were involved with slavery and those questions. Those are all questions that were at the forefront of student uprisings in South Africa 4 or 5 years ago. There's also a sense of, oh my God, again, does the world have to pay obeisance to America, the great God America, even in setting its political agenda? So there's a kind of resentment to America, assuming that they're somehow both the leaders of the moral good and of the moral evil, but whichever way you look at it, they're still the big dog in town. So there's some resentment against that. So there's been some solidarity protests outside the American embassy, but of a very small nature compared to what happened in Europe. I mean, places like Belgium are just waking up to their colonial past now, whereas the question of colonialism and how it impacts and its long-term questions are very much within the general discourse of South Africa. It was a little bit the same after 9/11, when suddenly America woke up to discovering, oh, we are not all invulnerable. We are also vulnerable people. To say, well, welcome, join the rest of the world.
You know, you were mentioning the monuments, and it made me think so much about your ruminations and your thoughts about memory and forgetting, and perhaps even one could say the ethical needs at certain moments of forgetting. What do you feel is happening now that will, perhaps unfortunately or not, be forgotten?
Well, it's always a question of what you do with old monuments. It's one of the things where there's no good solution. There are different bad and less bad solutions, but there are a lot of imaginative solutions that are possible. So it doesn't work to pretend that those figures in history didn't exist or that they didn't leave their particular legacies behind them. But it also doesn't work to leave them still on their pedestals as if their historical position is unchanged. So you need something that both acknowledges the history but shifts it. And I think there are different possibilities. One is to take people off their pedestals, literally, remove the sculptures from the pedestals, put them down on the ground, even dig a kind of depression in the ground in which you can go down to see them, should you so wish, and leave the plinths open for new thoughts, new figures, new sculptural events. There was a very good solution in Belgium where they had King Leopold, who presided over the death of so many millions of people in his private fiefdom of the Congo, where I think in Ostend, it was in a seaside town in Belgium, there was one of many statues of King Leopold on his plinth, and at the base, a number of Africans with their grateful hands reaching up towards him in an attitude of thankfulness. And some clever person simply went along and cut off those hands. So you suddenly had a monument of King Leopold presiding over a whole series of people with amputated arms, a reference to the amputation of hands of people who hadn't reached their rubber quotas in the Congo colony at that time. So there are different ways of doing. You can have a whole graveyard of old monuments the way they have in Moscow, where all the portraits of Lenin, Engels, Stalin, and Marx are gathered together in a rather astonishing garden of one of their museums, where you see every different style of sculpture and how 20 different ways of carving a Kalashnikov rifle out of granite, 30 different ways of making a portrait of Lenin or Stalin. So there are different solutions to it, and I think the very fact of the plethora of solutions shows a kind of indeterminacy, a provisionality of all of our decisions about how to deal with the past. And the very fact that it's an unsolved problem is the one hope we have, I think.
It made me think of I don't know in which book of David Lowenthal, who's a phenomenal geographer. He was speaking about the Elgin marbles and the Elgin marbles at the British Museum. He said in all likelihood they won't be returned, but what can happen productively is that the very dialogue, discourse, and discordant discourse that exists around the Elgin marbles should be on the walls for people to understand that museums are so often the product of plunder. So let's expose it. And then I went to Athens, and in Athens, the Acropolis Museum has all those spaces that are empty that let you understand that the real treasures are not in Athens but are at the British Museum. So there's a dialogue there. That doesn't mean that the solution is perfect, but at least it makes people think.
I think it is a question that there is very recent colonial plunder, which one feels, how can it stay where it is? But there's also a kind of essential identity politics which becomes impossible. Saying every Madonna needs to go back to Italy. Every piece of sushi should only be eaten in Japan. Every piece of classical art must go back to Greece, to separate the world into its tiny different private corners, where our history should show us that the one hope we have is a kind of cosmopolitanism, a cross-pollination, a misunderstanding of different cultures, a mistranslation of different elements. So I think there isn't a good single solution.
There are many bad solutions.
There are many bad solutions, but there are many. There was a question, for example, when Cape Branly was made, which was a museum saying, let us show the proper ritual significance of works of art from Africa and Oceania, so that they're not just seen as abstract pieces of aesthetic enjoyment, but have a particular meaning. And so a lot of them were taken from the Louvre, where they've been sort of elevated to works of art to shift across. And for me, both solutions are no good. It's no good to pretend that they don't have this extraordinary aesthetic quality which has inspired so many people all over the world and does backwards and forwards. And it doesn't work to pretend that they didn't come from a particular context either. So I have a sense when they were in their ambulances being driven from the Louvre to the Quai Branly and backwards and forwards, that's when they're at their most authentic, when the position of them shows the impossible situation.
That's fantastic.
And the Elgin marble also, one has a sense of what is it? What is the desire of the marble? And you have the very strange paradox in Europe, primarily, where you have on the one hand this desperate hanging on to artifacts that have come from the southern hemisphere, from Africa, from other places. At the same time, you have the European borders getting tighter and tighter and more guarded against migrants coming from those very places to Europe. So we'll keep their objects, but we'll certainly try to keep the people away. And I think for me, that's also going to be one of the long-term consequences of the pandemic, is that it will give a kind of respectability to some of the worst impulses of people, of self-protection, of not wanting people from other parts of the world to come there, which will now be done on the basis of health and who's infected and who's not infected.
Arundhati Roy recently wrote a piece about the pandemic being a portal, a possible portal. I take it that for you, from what you just said, that portal might have very dire consequences rather than opening.
Well, I think it's also an interesting portal. So, for example, you had in Europe and America many views on social spending, on public health, which would have been anathema to neoliberals until recently, but suddenly became mainstream points of discussion, where one understood that you needed a public health system to deal with the pandemic like this. You couldn't just rely on private health facilities. There were these huge government bailouts for private enterprise, whereas before you would have said private enterprise must sink or swim on its own. Suddenly it became the most common knowledge that you needed state intervention to try to support people's livelihoods. So in that sense, I think it does reopen debates about private ownership, about what the responsibility of the state is in supporting its citizens, which had been pushed right to the very margins of political discourse for decades. So in that sense, I think it is a portal. I think there are possibilities.
And what's always interested me so much, William, in your thinking, is this emphasis on ambivalence, but even better said, uncertainty. And you say uncertainty means also leaving the space for many different possible answers and solutions. And we just spoke about solutions, various bad solutions, or nearly the dissolution of a solution. What would productive uncertainty look like at this moment?
In Johannesburg, we have a small art center that was instrumental in founding 4 years ago, which is called the Center for the Less Good Idea.
Not for the good idea. I love it.
But for the less good idea, on the basis that there are so many grand programs, so many grand ideas. To take it as a most literal, the first idea you have for a project, a drawing, a book, a film, a story, you start with the big idea, but you need to be open to things that come from the edges, from the periphery. There needs to be a kind of peripheral thinking, like peripheral vision, in which a new connection, not expected with the first good idea, when that emerges, and that's what we call the less good idea, to allow these things to come in, to make a space for provisionality and uncertainty. On the basis that, politically as well as in other ways, all the grand ideas, all these huge, all-encompassing ideas have been calamitous. So the only hope is for a number of smaller, separate things that can solve particular problems or work in different ways. So I think that provisionality in that sense implies a modesty. It implies not believing you're in control of all circumstances, not believing that people are just ciphers or pieces of data to be manipulated as you wish. And I think that's for me both the artistic hope, but also it has a political implication buried in it.
Ethical and political, and I think I remember you saying that the name for the institute came from a saying about doctors in South Africa.
Yes. It's a Tswana proverb, which is, if the good doctor can't cure you, find the less good doctor.
It's fantastic.
If your grand idea is not going to save you, look for other smaller ones at the edges.
I was also reminded, that I'm a quotomaniac by profession. I was reminded, I like how quickly you said yes. I was reminded of this wonderful line by Buñuel. Luis Buñuel said, "I have always been on the side of those who seek the truth, but I part ways with them when they think they have found it."
Yes, I think that's a very good. That's one of the very many good aphorisms that you do have, and they should all be paraded because they're all useful and great.
Well, they are useful.
You had a very nice quote about parallel lines.
Oh, I did. I'll tell it for the listeners.
Yes.
It was after I went to see one of your productions that I simply adore, of the Nose. You had an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, at the Modern Museum. You had also a fantastic rendition of the opera at the Met Opera in New York, and we had a conversation at the New York Public Library so many years ago. And I remember one of the grand moments of that evening was your father was in the front row. I'll never forget his presence there, I must say, and him crossing the street afterwards, looking dapper with his hat. But I remember quoting Nabokov in his book on Gogol, talking about digression and what digression is and how to describe Gogol's digressive style. And he says, if two parallel lines do not meet, it is not because meet they cannot, but because they have other things to do.
Yeah, for me that's such a great thing to hang on to.
Why?
From the nature of certainty.
Why?
Well, firstly, it gives the parallel lines immediately makes one think of Paul Klee's line and his idea of what drawing is, which is taking a line for a walk. And it's always a question, are you taking the line for a walk, like taking a dog, or is the dog on its leash leading you? Is the line, in fact, leading you? So the railway line, which you assume is going exactly the way it seems to point, but at a certain point can veer off. And your long-held certainty that those lines are, in fact, forever connected together is a kind of arrogance about certainty of the world. So I think it had to do with that, a mixture of foreplay, of lines, of drawing, and certainty.
And also the notion of, certainty is always so worrisome, because certainty and fundamentalism seem to go together so beautifully.
Well, certainty and fundamentalism go together, and certainty always needs to be backed up by an army. In every certain pronouncement, there's going to be someone standing behind the speaker with a gun to enforce that certainty. It's always a claim of certainty, but it's really always only possible with recourse to authoritarianism.
I in mentioning your father, and I so remember, William, him crossing 42nd Street.
Yes,
in the traffic. I think it was raining, and he must be in his late 90s now.
Yes, he's 97, enjoying his quiet lockdown in London, in his London house, but missing going to the opera and seeing his friends again.
And I don't exactly know how to ask you this question, but I will nevertheless try. How do you think, or do you think that you're continuing in some form your father's project?
Well, I'm working on a project at the moment in the studio, which is a series of films, kind of episodic in form, about making things in the studio, but more specifically making meaning in the studio. And I've discovered that one of the elements of these episodes are either conversations or interrogations of myself, in which two versions of myself sit on each side of the table, and one questions the other and answers it. And I discover, whether I like it or not, one of them has the tone and the voice of my father, the rational, cross-examining one. And the other one is much less certain and kind of tries to bluster his way out of these questions. So he certainly sits, deeply within me. That's kind of a shock when I hear how much his voice is also in me. Even our activities, his of a very clear-cut, rational advocate and lawyer, and me being an artist specifically in a way to avoid that rational understanding of the world, to allow much more absurdist, illogical understanding, but I think still with an idea of trying to understand what the world is and who we are in it, which is, of course, the corollary to what ought we to be doing it. So in the long term, they don't feel entirely different, although the techniques and methods are obviously very different to each other.
Can you say something for our listeners about the work of your father?
Well, both my parents were lawyers in South Africa during the height of apartheid, and both in the different ways. My father with quite high-profile political cases, and my mother with founding public interest law firm, were very vital in one of the different battles against the apartheid system, which was fought on many different ways, between the armed struggle and civil unrest, and also in the field of legal battles in the courts. And in that, they were both very important to the history of law in South Africa, and through that, in the struggle against apartheid.
I was saying a little bit earlier that I wanted to ask you what you're working on in your garden, and you've responded a little bit. What else? Yeah. What else? And also, William, what gives you solace now, and what are you looking at, and what are you reading? And may I just add one more element? What are you listening to, and maybe even viewing if it's in film? I'm just curious.
Yes, there's many different questions. So there are drawings in the studio, and there are activities in the studio which are filmed, like these conversations with myself. There's been a series of drawings of trees, large trees the size of the wall of a studio. And on the one hand, there's a pleasure in what it is to accumulate the bits of painting of a tree and gradually grow the tree in the process of painting. It's painted on with ink on different pages of old encyclopedias, and these are then pasted together to make the tree. But you can edit it by adding more pages or prune the tree by cutting pages out and sticking other ones on. So it's a large collage of the tree. So there's a pleasure in the ink and the paper and the making, but it also connects to one of the other projects which has to do about thinking about oracles and sibyls and fate. And there's a story about the sibyl, and you would go to consult the sibyl, the Cumaean sibyl outside Naples, to ask her your fate, as we are all kind of wondering about our fate now with the uncertainty of this virus traveling around the world, both as a real threat, sometimes as a threat larger in the way it looms in our head than it actually is physically, and sometimes the reverse. But at any rate, the sense of what is our fate is a question in the air. And you would go to the sibyl and you would ask her your fate, and she in her cave would write your answer on the leaf of an oak tree. And then you would go to the mouth of the cave to pick up your fate, to pick up your leaf and find out what your fate was. But always, as you approached the mouth of the cave, there would be a wind that would blow, and the pile of leaves would swirl up. So you never knew if the leaf that you picked was your fate or someone else's fate. So it's about leaves and leaves of book, pages of books that swirl and blow around. But it's also the sense of one's death growing inside one. There's a way in which you can think we know that from the moment you're born, you're also busy on your way towards an eventual death. But there's a sense of almost growing your death like growing a tree inside of you. And we feel you've had a good life when the death inside you has grown to be a full-sized tree and fully reached its extent, which can then be relieved. So there's a way in which growing a tree, or these paintings of trees, are both an acknowledgement of death that comes towards all of us, but a wish for a beautiful, magnificent tree rather than a stunted growth cut off too early, which is what our fear is of all these premature mortalities. So I'm drawing trees also.
And well, I'd love to ask you what you're reading, what you're listening to,
I'm reading.
Yeah, what you're reading, what you're listening to, and what might offer you, to quote Gershom Scholem, what might offer you shards of hope, perhaps, or not.
Okay, so solace is definitely in the studio. The actual physical activity of working, however you're feeling after 2 hours in the studio with the paper, with the charcoal and the ink, there's a kind of comfort of the studio saying, come on, it's okay, let's just get to work. It'll go on as long as it does. When it stops going on, that's also okay. But this is your space where you should be. So there's a comfort in the physical. It feels like it's not waiting, it's getting on with things in the studio. That feels, whereas so many people, all my friends who are actors, who are musicians, who are dancers, are completely in the situation of being unable to practice their métier. Here I feel my métier has been given a good space to flow. I'm reading, what am I reading? At 3 a.m, I'm reading old Eric Ambler and Len Dayton thrillers from the 1940s and 50s and 60s. That's when I can't sleep, so I need something that's easy enough to fall asleep. I'm rereading a lot of Mayakovsky because I have a project brewing in my head of Mayakovsky project, so that's the serious book that's next to my bed. And because it's Mayakovsky, I'm also listening to more Shostakovich. But when I'm quietly drawing, and I just want something that I'm half aware of, but I don't do a good listening to, then somehow a whole lot of Haydn piano music and Haydn symphonies are on my Spotify or Apple Music at the moment.
William, what a pleasure to speak to you. And I only wish we had more time.
Yes, but it's been lovely talking to you.
It really, really has been. And thank you for indulging me with my quotations, even asking me to go back to the parallel lines not meeting. I hope we meet soon. And
yes, I hope so too.
I really do. And I wish you all the best and a very productive, fruitful time. I look forward to seeing what this moment has brought about and seeing many of your trees.
Great.
Take good
Thank you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.